I want to introduce Thomas Arnett. Thomas is going to give us a talk on disruptive innovation and its impact on K-12 education. Thomas is a senior research fellow in education for the Clayton Christensen Institute. His work focuses on studying innovations that amplify educator capacity, documenting barriers to the K-12 innovation, and identifying disruptive innovations in education. Thomas previously served as a trustee and a board president for the Morgan Hill Unified School District. Thomas, would you join us?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. I want to start off my talk by highlighting a problem that exists in schools across the United States and around the world. And I want to illustrate this by telling a story about my experience as a teacher. I want to introduce you to 3 students. First up is a kid named Garyon. Garyon was one of the most sincere and earnest kids that ever walked into my class. He'd show up, get out his notebook, focus on the front of the room, was ready to learn. Problem was, Garyon only came to class maybe 2 or 3 days a week. Garyon, as I came to find out, was homeless, and he had bigger issues to deal with in his life than my class on a day-to-day basis. And because of that, Garyon had big gaps in his learning, and often I'd look back at him during class and just see kind of a look on his face like everything was going over his head. The other student I want to mention is a kid named Danny. Before Danny reached my class in the 8th grade, he had had open heart surgery 4 times. Those experiences made Danny super motivated to become a doctor when he grew up, and he knew that to be a doctor he had to do well in school. But math wasn't necessarily Danny's best subject, and some days I could see it was clicking for him and he was excited. Other days I could see he was confused and struggling. Now, the last student I'll mention is a girl named Marshana. And of these 3 students, Marshana was my problem student. She was a good kid, but she was really bright, and that often meant she got bored. And she let me know by talking to her neighbors there in our class. Now, this challenge that I faced was, how do I meet the needs of Garyon, of Marshana, of Danny, and of all the students in between, given the wide variety of places they're coming from and challenges that they face. And this is a problem faced by teachers around the world. Now, there's a couple solutions to this problem, potential solutions. One is, we'll just make teachers work harder. Make them do better at lesson planning and do better at differentiated instruction. And it sounds nice until you realize that teachers are operating in a system that was never designed to offer hyper-individualized instruction. And working against that system means a lot of teachers are really working overtime and struggling and still not meeting the mark. Well, there's another option, and that is, ideally, we just hire an individual tutor for every single one of these students. But at a practical level, that quickly becomes unaffordable. But there's a third solution that I want to present about today that has the potential to transform education, that is actually already underway. And this is an idea that can really transform this problem for teachers. See, if we think about teacher time, you can think about all of their time and their capacity being represented by this green circle. And the reality is, teachers today, especially when you consider not only meeting their students' individual needs, but preparing their students for life in a global, high-tech society and a diverse world, there's a lot more than teachers can reasonably fit on their plate, and they often end up doing triage. But something that can help solve this problem is an idea called disruptive innovation. Now, most of you have probably heard the term disruptive innovation or disruption used to refer often to the next latest and greatest thing. But there's actually a body of rigorous research behind this idea developed by the man pictured here, Clayton Christensen. And disruptive innovation is a theory that explains how new upstarts in an industry can go on to tackle and outmaneuver large incumbents in their industries. So in the business world, it's this great theory of competitive response, of competitive market dynamics. But in our work at the nonprofit Clayton Christensen Institute, we look at this through a slightly different lens. And that is that disruptive innovation also describes a process that makes products and services more accessible and affordable, and thereby making them available to larger populations of society. Now, I'm with a technical audience, and so I'm going to give you a little bit of technical detail behind how this process works. And bear with me, because I'll need you to stay focused as I go through this next slide. But if you hang with me, this is really interesting stuff and really illustrates some powerful things that we see in the world. So these three circles that I put up here, I want you to think of them as representing different segments of society. In the inner circle, you have people with lots of wealth and lots of expertise. And as you go into the outer circles, you have people with progressively less wealth and less expertise. Now in that inner circle, I want to put up a graph. On the x-axis, we have time. On the y-axis, we have performance. And there's two really interesting trends I want to highlight here. The first one is what we call people's ability to use improvements in new innovations and technologies. And what we found is that this is an upward sloping trend, but it's pretty gradual. And the reason being is that people's lives don't change that much from one day to the next. And the bigger issues that we're often struggling with aren't that different from even one year to the next. Now, the really interesting other trend is what we call the pace of performance improvement. And what you'll notice is that when a new innovation enters the scene, it usually starts off serving just people in this inner circle. And in the early days of the innovation, it underperforms. It doesn't quite meet that bar of performance that they expect. But over time, the organizations and companies that offer these innovations are highly motivated to better meet the needs of those customers. And so they make improvements to the technology. Sometimes these are small incremental leaps, like I've just shown. Sometimes they're big leaps forward. But all of these we call sustaining innovations, because these are improvements that sustain how the existing technology meets the needs of the people, of its existing customers in that inner circle. Now, disruptive innovation is of a different nature. If you remember that outer circle, we call those people non-consumers because they don't have access to the technologies in the inner circle, either because they're too expensive, or they're too geographically centralized, or they're too complicated to use for the average person. When a disruptive innovation comes onto the scene, it often looks really crummy along the traditional way that we measure performance for the established technology. But disruptive innovations offer other benefits, such as customizability, ease of use, affordability, which makes them not only applicable to non-consumers, but highly appealing. Because for non-consumers, a crummy technology is way better than no technology at all. So to illustrate this, let me talk about computers real quick. When Apple and IBM and other computer manufacturers first started making desktop computers, these weren't machines that they then took to big corporations and said, hey, you don't need to buy mainframes or workstations anymore, just buy one of these desktops. Because corporations would have just laughed at them and said, that crummy thing, it can't do what we need. So desktop computers got their start really as a toy, an educational toy for students, or as a toy for hobbyists to tinker with in their garages. Now, for these non-consumers, these individuals, a desktop computer was great because it brought the price down to around $2,000, something that they could afford, and gave them access for the first time to computing. But we all know the rest of the story. Apple, IBM, other computer companies kept improving the desktop computer until it got to a point where companies started to look at it and say, you know what? For a lot of our applications, this can actually do the trick now. And that's when the sector really got transformed. But it's important not to forget, disruptive innovations, like the desktop computer, start off in this space of non-consumption. So to further illustrate this, these two columns just draw the contrast between these two types of innovations, sustaining innovation on the left and disruptive innovation on the right. And what you'll see across the board is that the disruptive innovations on the right, when they started off, were all crummy compared to the things that were more mainstream at the time. But they started off also serving non-consumers or non-consuming situations. So we've already talked about desktop computers. Consider now cell phones or voice over IP. When both of these technologies emerged, they didn't have the type of quality and fidelity that you'd get from a landline to your home or office. But in the case of cell phones, they made it so you could access telephone communication in contexts where you could never access it before. And with voice over IP, they made it so that all of a sudden it was affordable to make long-distance calls to other continents. Same thing with affordable compact cars. When Toyota first came to the United States, they weren't selling Lexuses to compete with Cadillac. They were selling this crummy thing called the Corona. that rusted, that broke down, but that made car ownership affordable to families and households that couldn't afford a car previously. Same thing with online retail. Amazon didn't start off being what we know it to be today. It started off selling books that were obscure that you couldn't find at your local bookstore, and then other products that you couldn't find at your local department store. And they'd ship them to places where maybe there wasn't a store available. So what does this have to do with education? We see in our research the same pattern playing out in education. Now with this diagram, this pyramid represents the same thing as those circles in the previous slide. At the top of the pyramid, you have people with lots of wealth, lots of expertise, and in the lower tiers, people with less wealth, less expertise. For most of human history, education was only available to the elite and wealthy in society in the form of personal tutoring. So think of like Alexander the Great getting tutored by Aristotle. Then, in the 19th century, we saw this wonderful innovation that today we know is the conventional classroom. And what this did was that people realized, hey, if we group students by age and they come from the same community, they more or less have the same learning needs, then we can put together a standardized sequence of grade levels and courses. And when students progress through this, most of them will graduate with some degree of basic literacy and numeracy. And this system worked great for the time that it was invented. Now, as I've already illustrated, though, we're getting to a place where just basic education is no longer good enough for our students and for meeting their needs. We need something that can more closely approach that private tutoring, individual tutoring model. And what we've seen is that online learning is this type of disruptive innovation that can take individualized learning and make it affordable to much broader segments of society. Now, how does this work? There's actually two pieces to this that I think are important to illustrate. One is that online learning individualizes on its own, in that one student can be watching or learning about fractions while another one learns about decimals. One student can be getting feedback from software on whether or not they added something correctly, while another student gets feedback on multiplication. But there's a second piece of this as well, and this gets back to the point about teacher capacity. When online learning takes over some of the work of instruction, it frees up educators to then have more time to engage with their students in a more individual way and to give students more individual high-quality feedback and basically to give students things that the technology can't do. It gives teachers more capacity to do the things technology can't do. Well, true to form, where did online learning start off? It started off addressing non-consumption. Now, we're fortunate in the US that we don't have non-consumption of education at large because we have free public education. But if you look across the country, there's tons of educational experiences and opportunities where there is non-consumption. Things like summer school, days when teachers are out, families that are migrants and don't have a good option, access to foreign languages other than the common French, German, and Spanish. Other settings like access to pre-K, access to after-school learning, access to AP or advanced courses. Online learning, when it got its start, started off serving these contexts, these learning situations, learners with these needs. But over time, we've seen it improve until now it's at the place where it's really coming into the mainstream, into core curriculum in mainstream classes. Now, in reality, it's the real flourishing of this has been in a form called blended learning, which is where you're combining online learning resources in a brick and mortar class setting with face-to-face instruction in a way that really captures the best that all these things have to offer. But the last thing I want to point out is that these changes are not changes that are going to happen overnight. To illustrate this, I actually want to tell a story from outside education. In this picture here, you have a section of a factory as factories looked in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And what you'll notice is that there's this drive shaft near the ceiling and then wheels and belts down to the pieces of equipment. See, about a century ago, the way that equipment was powered in a factory was you had a big central steam engine. And that steam engine generated all of the mechanical power and then delivered it via mechanical means to all the pieces of equipment. And at that time, the way they organized a factory was they built it multi-story, and they figured out how can we, in 3 dimensions, get pieces of equipment that have high power demands as close to that central power source as possible. Well then, in the early 1900s, there was this thing invented called electricity. And factories realized, hey, electricity has some benefits. So what did they do? They took those large steam engines at the middle of the factory and replaced them with large electrical motors. Now, these things had some benefits. They weren't as noisy. They didn't produce soot and smoke. But they also had some drawbacks. They broke down more often because it was a more primitive technology. But replacing the steam engines with electric motors really didn't change the game for factory productivity. It wasn't until about 30 years later when factory managers realized, hey, we don't have to do it quite the same way. We can replace that large central power source with a bunch of smaller motors that actually sit in the individual pieces of equipment. And we can just run electricity to those pieces of equipment. And then we can start to organize the factory based on the flow of materials. So we'll line up the equipment so that material flows efficiently through our production process. And that change in the way the factory was organized, made possible through electrification, was what transformed factory productivity. Well, it's the same case with education. For us to really get to the type of individualized education that we'd like to see for students, it's not just a matter of replacing their textbooks with online texts or replacing worksheets with online learning software. Or replacing course materials with online materials. We've also got to rethink, how do we organize schooling? How do we structure schooling? And how do we make all these pieces fit together? If we don't do this, here's the challenge. If we don't do this, online learning just becomes another thing for teachers to manage that doesn't really benefit them. But if we do this well, and we rethink schooling, it has the potential to actually expand the frontier of what teachers are able to do, so that not only can they take on the demands that we currently have on their shoulders, but then have capacity to do things that right now are just impractical or infeasible, things that are beneficial to their students. And to tie this all back, why does this matter? Because we have children growing up today that need to be prepared to live in a world that is global and to be able to have a livelihood in a world where many things have been automated by machines. In order to prepare children to thrive and succeed in that world, we need to make this transformation happen. Fortunately, disruptive innovation is the catalyst that's moving us there. And the good news for everyone here in this room is that all of you, I imagine, are engaged in one way or another in figuring out how to make the reorganization and the reconfiguration work and work smoothly so that we can really see this come to play. Thank you.